Let's go.
Lima, 20 años, nacido en Ecuador, muere en el CIE de Barcelona el 19 de febrero del 2009. Di su nombre. A.B. 55 años, nacido en Marruecos,
egresado al CIE de Zapadores, Valencia, el 16 de octubre del 2010. Su nombre, Samba Fofana, nacida en Gambia, muere en la cárcel de ¡Di su nombre!
23 minutos. 23 minutos. Muere un niño, un joven asesinado en Brasil.
Yo hablo de miles, de millones de hombres a los que sabiamente se les ha inculcado el miedo, el complejo de inferioridad, el temblor, el arrodillamiento, la desesperación, el servilismo, a empezar discursos sobre el colonialismo 1950. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tjaša. I'm from the European Network of Women of African Descent. I'm here today in solidarity of our brother who died in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, in the hands of police brutality, George Floyd. I'm here to tell you that we are humans. Dignified housing. We have right to healthcare. We have right for us to live just like any other human being on this planet Earth.
en ese contexto es importante para nosotros hablar de cómo surge, cuándo y cómo se organiza SENAE y cómo en este contexto de las protestas emitís también el manifiesto. Para nosotros sería importante hablar de qué significa para ti y para la comunidad negra, africana y afrodescendiente en España, que es SENAE, emitir este manifiesto.
Efectivamente, en el 7 de junio de 2020 se organizaron en el Reino de España, en diferentes ciudades simultáneamente, pues estas concentraciones de protesta, ¿no? Imbuidos también por el fervor a nivel mundial también que estaba habiendo, ¿no? Eso fue algo que jugó mucho a favor de la multitud de gente que acudió a estas concentraciones y del alcance que tuvieron, ¿no? las manifestaciones. Me atrevería a decir que fueron las concentraciones multitudinarias más grandes de los últimos tiempos en cuanto a autoorganización de la comunidad negra, africana y afrodescendiente en España. Y por lo tanto tienen una importancia capital, ¿no? para el movimiento radical negro en estas tierras. Llegamos a esa concentración, pues como decía, ¿no? Imbuidos también por ese mainstream y siendo un poquito el resultado de la lucha de la sociedad civil negra de los últimos años, quizá la última década, ¿no? En la que había habido diferentes iniciativas populares, diferentes manifestaciones, quizá diría desde el asesinato de Lucrecia Pérez, ¿no? Pues la comunidad ya empezó como a dar ese paso, ¿no? De lo individual a lo colectivo, ¿no? Que es uno de los mayores retos que tiene la comunidad negra, africana y afrodescendiente en España, ya no solo desde SENAE, sino como articulación del sujeto político negro autónomo, que es el objetivo al final, ¿no? de esta organización. Entonces, para la comunidad lo que significa esa fecha, esas movilizaciones y todo el contexto y la creación de SENAE después, pues básicamente es eso, ¿no? Ese punto de inflexión a partir del cual se articula de una manera o se empieza a articular de una manera más sólida lo que es el sujeto político negro autónomo, con la intención clara y clarísima de hacer incidencia política a todos los niveles, no solamente institucional, obviamente, sino primeramente y más importante a nivel de calle, a nivel de base, ¿no?
How, from your point of view, from the group that you stay together, you see the connections between fascism and coloniality. So how these two things function in Spain, it's actually really the space historically and presently that fascism and coloniality come together almost as unitary system.
Aquí sí que me gustaría un poco hablar sobre la complejidad de la comunidad negroafricana y afrodescendiente en cuanto a puntos de abordaje, ¿no? de la problemática o cosmovisiones heterogéneas dentro de nuestra propia comunidad. Aquí juega un papel muy importante la diferencia entre negroafricanos y afrodescendientes, ¿no? entendiendo el contexto cultural y el bagaje migratorio que tiene cada una de las particularidades o comunidades dentro de nuestra propia comunidad, ¿no? Si bien el manifiesto, como decía antes, el manifiesto y todas las concentraciones, esa autoorganización fue un punto de inflexión en la incidencia política de nuestra comunidad, también fue un reto, ¿no? Porque implicó un trabajo colectivo, implicó un sentarse a dialogar, a pensar colectivamente de qué manera abordar una problemática que nos afecta de manera transversal dentro de nuestras comunidades, pero que no todo el mundo ve de la misma manera o a la que no todo el mundo reacciona de la misma manera, ¿no? Entonces, uno de los retos principales es precisamente esa cosmovisión y esa relación entre el colonialismo, el neocolonialismo, la memoria histórica y las afectaciones materiales de esas consecuencias históricas que tiene hoy en día en nuestros cuerpos negros y en nuestra manera de habitar el espacio, ¿no? las personas negroafricanas en general, con bagaje migratorio, digamos, actual desde África, hay momentos en los que no entienden bien qué es lo que significa ser un cuerpo negro diaspórico y todos los impedimentos a nivel de construcción de nuestras propias identidades y nuestras propias autopercepciones, ¿no? La gravedad de esas implicaciones, ¿no? Hay veces que no se entiende bien, porque es verdad que la violencia contra los cuerpos negros migrantes africanos es muy explícita y muy deshumanizadora, evidentemente, y lo vemos con las cifras de abandonos de las rutas migratorias que provocan pues, todas esas muertes constantes, ¿no? en el Mediterráneo y en todas las rutas, también en el Atlántico, en Canarias. Pero a nivel de afrodescendientes diaspóricos, la violencia es muchísimo más sutil y sibilina, porque es una ruptura de nuestras identidades desde que nacemos, ¿no? Es esa aculturación constante que implica una reparación primero individual de nuestro propio querernos, ¿no? de nuestra propia autoestima, nuestra propia identidad, y la manera en la que habitamos el mundo. Eso es un trabajo que hay que hacer, digamos, primero internamente de forma individual para luego traspasarlo a lo colectivo. Entonces, el primer reto es comulgar todas esas cosmovisiones para caminar hacia un objetivo común contra la supremacía blanca, que es el origen, ¿no? al final, de todas esas manifestaciones violentas contra nuestros cuerpos en diferentes maneras. Yo creo que a partir de la articulación de CENAE, a partir de esas manifestaciones y todo el trabajo que se hizo para crear el manifiesto, para crear el decálogo de acción política de CENAE, se ha empezado como ese trabajo común de diálogo intracomunitario, ¿no? Para sanar y ya caminar hacia esa solución, ¿no? Entre comillas, es decir, tenemos claro el análisis, tenemos claro el contexto y entonces ahora ya caminamos hacia la transformación, empezando por nosotros mismos, ¿no? Entonces ha habido muchísimo diálogo entre diferentes realidades negras dentro de la construcción de todo lo que es el movimiento en el último, pues ya casi año y medio, porque claro, el tiempo pasa súper rápido y ya estamos acabando 2021 y hay muchísimos niveles de lo que vemos a través de esas conversaciones es que hay muchísimos niveles de conciencia, ¿no? Una de las cosas contra las que más tenemos que luchar dentro de la heterogeneidad de nuestras comunidades es ese individualismo occidental que yo siempre digo que es como ese cáncer, ¿no? El cáncer del individualismo occidental que nos hace pensar que una vez yo ya he reparado lo que a mí fuese que me me impidiese estar en paz con mi identidad y con mi manera de habitar el mundo, pues ya está, ¿no? Entonces, el traspaso a lo colectivo es el reto que se está superando ahora. Entonces, las personas que más concienciadas están con ese traspaso a lo colectivo ven enseguida esas afectaciones materiales y esa relación entre el colonialismo, el neocolonialismo, el extractivismo, la deshumanización, ¿no? Y seguimos un poquito más ese hilo histórico para entender todo en su global, más allá de analizarlo en cómo me afecta individualmente según mi realidad.
What could be looking the problems, looking what you face now, a certain goal for the political and social future of the LGBTQ plus movement, but also of Flori as an organization in the concrete Croatian space, or maybe wider, former Yugoslav space, or even wider, Europe, because you are part, as Croatia and Slovenia, part of the European Union.
Recently, someone asked me what was different when we found Lori, if I look nowadays, and if we talk about homophobia and transphobia. And I said that, for example, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, that homophobia and transphobia were widespread, yes, but we had understanding that with that kind of homophobia and transphobia, we can have a dialogue. That they are growing from misunderstanding, from prejudice, from not being informed, not being educated. So we had a feeling that we can talk to that homophobia and transphobia and spread this good news about human rights, and people then will change their opinion. But now, this kind of homophobia and transphobia, we cannot have dialogue. That is my opinion. We can watch it, observe it, and pay very good attention. I think that we are now on a crossroad. What I can see, it's a worrying rise in intolerance of LGBTIQ people in Europe, in all over Europe. We can see what is happening in Poland, in Hungary, in other countries, but in Poland and Hungary, okay, we can see LGBT-free zone and things like that. This is a fascism itself. So if you think we had a progress and nobody thought that, that this could happen. But this is happening. And I see like it is a crossroad. So right-wing conservative parties and organizations are using social prejudice against LGBTIQ for their own political goals, for their own power. They are defending traditional values, which is of course just fictional. Doesn't exist. They use hate speech against LGBT people. They introduced LGBTI ideology, another thing that is not existing. And also just to divert public attention away from government failure to address pressing social issues and rising inequalities and attacks on human rights and democracy. So that is just a political agenda. But if we don't pay attention, I think, yes, we could end very badly. So it's a crossroad. Anti-gender movement is on the rise, as I said, well-funded and organized. There is a slowdown, stagnation in protection of LGBTI human rights, especially in affirming and introducing policies and laws regarding health, trans health and legal gender recognition. And we can all see this is from reports of international LGBTIQ organizations and also from European Parliament. And so it is not just that I'm just talking out of nowhere. So we see inequality in all segments, in education, in workplace. We have, in Croatia, for example, we have textbooks with very homophobic and transphobic contents. We have a latest research from European Union Fundamental Rights Agency, and that is the greater research among LGBTIQ people in Europe and also in two other countries, Serbia and North Macedonia. So 140,000 people in this research, and we have, for example, in Croatia, we have just 4% of LGBTIQ students are open in their schools, just 4%. We have also almost 60 to 70% people who were discriminated in their workplace and in public institutions, and also 65% people who experience violence, and so on, so on. So I just wanted to say that it is our reality. We also still have situations that people do not hold hands to each other in the street. So this is basics. It is not about some big stuff, but it's basics. That is my fear also when I think about this crossroads. In Lori, for example, when 2013, when that movement anti-gender and anti-LGBTIQ started, we were not aware what is happening because we were gaining some success in legislation. We were just very close to have a Life Partnership Act and things like that. We had a feeling like we are on the top of the world. And then we have LGBTI-free zones. And then we have a ban on talking on LGBTI subjects. And then we have bans of LGBTI pride marches also in Europe. I think that we have to start thinking about with what we are dealing, use that solidarity, what we talked about before, regarding all human rights, not just LGBTIQ, and maybe push forward in some other social road, not just fighting our own battle, but trying to rethink social structures and maybe to build some other society, to introduce some other kind of thinking that will not be based on oppression.
In your ample and compelling dissertation and further research work, you emphasize the inseparability of sexual and social transgressions from capitalist accumulation. So what would you say are the main forms of historical reification of sexual desire? How do you explain these processes? And if you can give us some examples.
The idea of the historical reification of desire comes from this queer Marxist theorist, Kevin Floyd. He wrote a book that was published in 2009, The Reification of Desire. Floyd is really one of the first people to kind of think about queer Marxism in those terms, as in like queer Marxism, what does this mean? Floyd argues in that book that across the 20th century, psychoanalysis as a discipline of knowledge and thought and self-understanding really functioned to solidify and I guess you could say kind of objectify, if we're talking about what reification as a word means, how people understand themselves as sexual subjects. So psychoanalysis teaches us that we go through this developmental phase from infantile sexuality to a full adult sexuality where heteronormativity is in Freudian terms at least, the kind of the goal, and that like what we might call queer sexualities or bisexualities are like aspects of knowledge that get overcome in that process, in the developmental process towards heterosexuality. And so Floyd's really arguing that psychoanalysis as a discipline of knowledge that people have access to functions in the same way that reification, which is this idea that George Lukács really puts together in his work, History and Class Consciousness. And Lukács is really talking about the forms of labour that take place and how labour practices in the 20th century, under the rationalizations of what's Fordism or Taylorist production processes, lead to this like simplification of labour. So we become de-skilled as labourers, our tasks become more specific, we do them repetitively. And whilst Lukács is talking about the production line, Floyd's basically argues sexuality undergoes the same kind of process, that becomes repetitive, that we almost become these like contemplative subjects in this role. Floyd doesn't go as far to argue that, but I would say that if we're really talking about reification, we have to think about this dialectic of, on the one hand, reification is talking about this kind of like passive conditions under which we're acting. And then simultaneously, we're still kind of agents within that. We're still agents of labor. We're still agents of sexuality, even if we're responding to these kind of conditions that are just encouraging us to do one thing or to be in one way. So that would be the idea of the reification as desire as laid out by Floyd, and maybe through my interpretation of it. I would say that actually the forms of sexuality that are promoted within capitalist cultures, at least from where I am in Western Europe, they do tend to reproduce certain kinds of sexual subjects, in the sense of like certain bodies or positionalities are presented as sexual subjects whilst others are not. There's plenty of images of white men and white cisgender heteronormative men and women, white cisgender gay men, I would say, not so much queer women, but in culture that do reproduce these ideas that, you know, whiteness is desirable, that to be cisgender is also still like this kind of coveted sexual position as a sexual subject, whilst trans and non-binary subjects kind of aren't really given space in public culture to articulate our sexualities, say. These are discursive processes, right? These are things that are happening, or discursive, or they're happening through culture, and culture is material. We're really talking about like what capital decides to fund and produce as culture, really. You know, I don't want to say that the agents of cultural producers don't have any say, because we do, and I'm a poet, you know, I position myself, I'm in that position too as a cultural producer, you know. But capital is really, you know, if we're talking about media and film and these like high, you know, what Floyd would call these like capital intensive forms of visibility, and that's a quote, then we are really talking about, that involves money, that involves production in these great ways. So I think this does fall into this wider sense of like, what is acceptable within capitalism for LGBTQ people, subjects? What forms of relationships and what kinds of sexual desires? And the history of the AIDS crisis is still quite recent in terms of history, in terms of like how certain sexualities get kind of pathologized in certain ways, in terms of pathologies around AIDS and HIV, but also in terms of what kinds of stigmas attach themselves to what kind of sexual practices. I think that's all in the mix if we're talking about what sexual practices or sexual desires are really at the center of culture, or of what is socially acceptable. And so for me, queerness is still really about challenging that social acceptability and those, and like, you know, where transgression comes from bodies, it comes from practices, it comes from everyday lives, it comes from what we do with our bodies and with ourselves.
You are actually saying where is the working class that we can discuss, in which way what is this force? And one possibility will be to think really the place of technology in all this transformation.
A lot of people want to see the working class as a larger coalition that is composed by various kinds of people and interests that would cover, an intersectional alliance where you have racialized people, where you have trans people, you would have working class women in that sort of a coalition. So I want to think about that question a little bit differently. So to make sense a little bit about the role of technology and what's technology, how technology is part of this Vampire 2 model. Thinkers from Yanis Varoufakis to McKinsey work seem to believe that exploitation function according to something either close to techno-feudalism or to a post-Marxist model that exploits information. So you have a sort of a cognitive form of exploitation where the ruling class is hoarding information. And digitalization, computers and phones are seen to be this driving technology that change capitalism fundamentally. So this is why the Armitage family in Get Out wants better and newer organs, because they need to adapt to this fast-pacing world. But the problem is, I would call this orientation to technology presentism, from present, right? You just focus on the present a lot, and you think that the present is special in some ways, because the present seems to neither fit in the sort of a Leninist category of imperialism, nor it doesn't fit very well in the sort of a Marxist understanding of the evolution of capitalism. This idea that technology is something completely new today, right? I think it misses in many ways how people in the past, or how in Marxist-Leninist states, people were able to imagine a real political alternative to capitalism. So to me, the role of technology as something completely new should be criticized as a dead end, because the question of technology cannot be separated from the problem of classes and how they are tied to particular national and geopolitical regimes.
Can you go back to the communism suffered from the main assault? How, in the most synthesized way, you will define this assault? Assault
that we're talking about is to a certain extent described by the term sunken place, the one that is used in Get Out. And that term seems to capture a feeling that is widespread today. There's sort of a feeling that your body is not your own, your space is not your own, your whole being has been colonized and appropriated by others, right? While Marxists, they're interested in offering explanations about history and the role of economics in capitalism, on the right, we see a sort of a growing interest in religious and anti-scientific ideas about body abduction, right? So this is a feeling that a lot of people share today, right? That their bodies are not their own. Mm-hmm. But I think that this feeling has a sort of a historical endpoint. Like, we don't have to feel this in the future as well. I remember when I was a communist boy, the 1980s, Romania, I was a little boy and I was reading the Romanian version of Iskra. The official newspaper of the party, right? I felt that I was part of a bigger collective. I was part of a world that shared the sort of aspiration towards socialism. That was a feeling that was very important for people in the 80s. And that feeling disappeared. And again, to go back to this feeling that our bodies are kind of used by others to be exploited, that feeling is very real for a lot of people, but it can be modified and transformed in different places. So now, I guess the assault on the sort of a communist, the assault on our social life, we can see it in the ideas that we're kind of stuck here. And this immobility is well captured by right-wing ideologies that tell people, look, they give people explanation. They say, look, your body is controlled by big business. The new right knows very well that that feeling has to be exploited. And I guess it'll be a little bit our role to try to do something else here.
Eğer bugününden kalan bir hatıraysa yarınlar hep karanlıktır, bunu sakın unutma. Sen dünyanı aydınlatacak ışık arasan da boşa kilit vurmuşlar kapılara. Gözlerimi açtığımda ilk defa bu dünyaya kendimi o anda yabancı buldum. Kayboldum gurbet kokan bir denizde, savruldum yabancılıkta doğduğum ülkede. Hayaller hep boş, insanlar çaresiz. Sen konuşmadan onlar sözünü kestirir. Sanki bunlardan devlet habersiz. Böyle bir şey bir arada yabancı olmak Avrupa gibi devleti yönetenler kimliğini unutturup dostum derler. Tutuşunca etekler, çalış derler, bitince işler git diye emreder.
Bırak denizleri bana, gideyim uzaklara. Kendimin kaptanı olup hazırım boğulmaya. Bırak geceleri bana, alışırım karanlığa. Bir mum yakıp ardından konuşurum yalnız.
Die Einsamkeit ist so tief auf keinen Anfang oder Ende. Was spricht, bis nicht du, sondern deine Seele. Das Leben ist ein Meer, vergiss nicht zu atmen, bevor dich das Wasser nimmt. Lern zu schwimmen. Ich war ein Kind und wurde ins Meer geworfen. Unter Blonden war ich der Einzige mit schwarzen Locken. Ja, ich war anders, ist das mein Fehler? Die Wurzeln trägt man bei sich und zwar immer. Jetzt stell ich die Frage, wie erklärt es sich? Hautfarben bilden den Wert und wie nährt es mich? Ist nicht jeder wertvoll, wir sind alle gleich. Egal ob Christ, Muslim, arm oder reich. Was dich nicht umbringt, macht dich stärker. Der Kampf geht jeden Tag immer weiter. Es gibt keine Wahrheit in der Welt, volle Lügen. Ich bin ein Ausländer mit Vergnügen.
Bırak denizleri bana, gideyim uzaklara. Kendimin kaptanı olup hazırım boğulmaya. Bırak geceleri bana, alışırım karanlığa. Bir mum yakıp ardından konuşurum yalnızımla.
Zordur bazen hayat, yorar seni. Mutluluk da yan komşu gibi uğrar arada bir. Susuz bir çölde su arar misali. Yolunu kaybetmiş gibidir yabancı olmak.
Bırak denizleri bana, gideyim uzaklara. Kendimin kaptanı olup hazırım boğulmaya. Bırak geceleri bana, alışırım karanlığa. Bir mum yakıp ardından konuşurum yalnızımla.
You started a very important process that was absolutely outside of the mind of the civil society, also grassroots positions in Slovenia. This was about migration, racism, the administrative discrimination, the marginalization. And my question will be, could you reflect this from that moment on? What you found in Slovenia, because from that experience we get the front against racism and other movements going to rogue to expose things. So could you reflect this back through your position?
Info Colpa also, so yeah, let's connect it also to activism.
Yes, I think everything started in Slovenia with breakup and collapse of Yugoslavia, and plus when Slovenia entered the European Union. So I came to Slovenia in 2001, and then I met people who were fighting for the rights of erased. So I didn't know who are erased. I was just again swallowed in because that kind of events were very important for me as a person because they were very inclusive. I was a migrant, and I look like very Asian person and living in Slovenia, which is a very small European country where you don't have this melting pot, police will not racially profile you in the street, it's true, but you always feel this a little bit detached position of you and people and the territory you live in, you know, it's different. So I'm the one who always should make a first step saying, hey, hello, how are you, you know, because when I am in, for example, in a hall with people who are mostly Slovenians, they will never approach me because I'm different, you know. Oh, she's different. Maybe she doesn't speak Slovenian. So it's me who should always even approach and start first word. And this is how I see this, you know, effort of breaking through barriers, of getting included. And this is how we all together learned how to fight on the margins, how to recognize discrimination, and how to recognize systemic discrimination made by laws that appeared after the collapse of Yugoslavia, let's say. And the rock was answer to it.
Eğer bugününden kalan bir hatıraysa yarınlar hep karanlıktır, bunu sakın unutma. Sen dünyanı aydınlatacak ışık arasan da boşa. Kilit vurmuşlar kapılara. Gözlerimi açtığımda ilk defa bu dünyaya kendimi o anda yabancı buldum. Kayboldum gurbet, kokan bir denizde savruldum. Yabancılıkta doğduğum ülkede hayaller hep boş, insanlar çaresiz. Sen konuşmadan onlar sözünü kestirir. Sanki bunlardan devlet habersiz, böyle bir şey bir arada. Yabancı olma kavramı gibi devleti yönetenler kimliğini unutturup dostum derler. Tutuşunca etekler, çalış derler, bitince işler git diye emreder.
Bırak denizleri bana gideyim uzaklara, kendimin kaptanı olup hazırım boğulmaya. Bırak geceleri bana, alışırım karanlığa, bir mum yakıp ardından.
And the fight for erased was also answer to it. It was answer to very core position of a new nationalistic state. And of course, these different initiatives that we continued to work with or to establish, to organize, and most of it was connected to very incredibly fragile, not stable component like migrants, you know. One day you are here, another day you are not here. And whenever you are here, you are, you know, you are like nothing. Nobody will recognize you. And, you know, when you know that people live in European Union with their personal confirmation that nobody really wants them, then you know what to expect, right? So coming back to the regulations, one of the regulations that do not actually work is Dublin regulation. And I think new pact will cancel these Dublin regulations, but they are keeping the first safe country, you know. But these are again technical. From the political point of view, everybody has a right to move and ask for asylum and for protection wherever they want. Yes, there are rules, and these rules are somehow respected by national authorities who take care about this protection act. But generally, from my personal experience on the Balkan route, I see that people move on. And people, they stay when they feel good. They stay in some certain countries when they are forced to stay. For example, Dublin from France is functioning, and from Switzerland. So there are people who are coming to Slovenia from Switzerland, from France, by Dublin deportations. And from Germany, of course, it functions. But some countries, they do not do this. So it depends, you know. And this knowledge they have people, because they hear from each other, they read. Facebook is very helpful, WhatsApp is very helpful, and all these things. And they choose countries where they can be safe for some time and try to legalize, you know. And when we think about borders, we always think like, oh, these are very bad borders, right? But when you talk to people on the move, they know that it's not safe, but they accept it as their struggle, you know, as their fight, and they fight it. They go on and they try to forget it. They know that injustice starts on the border. And on the border, they find out that, this is kind of Europe we have, right? Okay. And then once they are inside of the European Union in big cities, they try to heal themselves by trying to legalize themselves, working hard, sending money to home, remittances from migrants to the third countries increased for almost 8% in last year. And this is a good, actually, data for ministers. Let people work, and then it's a win-win position. And we do all this, like in Slovenia, in Infokolpa. Infokolpa is actually an initiative that is somehow continued the second home and social center ROC. There is no ROC anymore, and second home was pogromized and demolished a little bit before. But people stay, and if you don't have a place to work, but now we have, then what you do? You move around, And what we did, we immediately went to Bosnia because, when this pushback started from Croatia to Serbia, and then people in a year found out that it's mission impossible and they started moving slowly. Well, what refugees do is very logical. If they see that this part of border is completely closed, impossible to pass, they change the route and they find a new road, and it was Bosnia. And in comparison to Belarus and Poland and Bosnia and Croatia and Slovenia, what is Bosnia? Bosnia is a country that probably doesn't function in terms of political institutions there, but it functions because there are people. There are people staying for 4 years and trying to cross the European Schengen border. In Belarus, probably you will not be able to do that because it's a much more strict system. In Slovenia, you cannot be outside. You will be immediately detained. And the same in Croatia. But in Bosnia, they build up some camps, some infrastructure. It's a big problem. And yes, it's so hard for people to survive, but still it's surviving. Numbers, big numbers of crossings. There are official numbers and there are unofficial numbers. And unofficial numbers are higher than official ones. So there are always people who just succeed. But when they succeed, they also know that they succeed, but there were some people who died. But refugee movement, from its very, very fragile position, it's maybe the bravest, the strongest, and the best movement for struggle, for right to stay, for freedom of movement, basics.
With this film, we want to simultaneously focus on questions about relationships between trans, decolonial, insurgent politics and strategies, decolonial feminist struggles, and Black thought, with reference to Black Marxism and 1990s post-socialism, that actually follows the history of racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, sexism, and homo-transphobia. So the questions we prepared are related with your article, Abolition, Geography, and the Problem of Innocence. And let's start with the first one. What defines the institutions of carceral geographies?
All right. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation and this project, which I think is very important, and we need more work like this being done everywhere. And one of the things we'll talk about a little today is how this work is being done everywhere. And that gives me great hope and optimism amidst all of the difficulties that you just so eloquently summarized. So the institutions of carceral geographies are many, and they extend from borders to normative regimes of sexuality, to the relations that appear natural but are actually social, that we call race, the obviously social and political categories of citizen and migrant. And also within all of this, the problems that more and more people on the planet have to make their livings and make their lives in an era of unfettered capitalism. Capitalism requires inequality, and many of those distinctions that you listed in your introductory remarks enshrine inequality. And so we struggle to undo capitalism in all of its forms, which I call shorthand racial capitalism, to remind people there is no possible inherent human flourishing under this mode of production, and to think about how the carceral interrupts people's lives by interrupting their flow, their movement, their everyday, and especially by extracting from people the one non-renewable resource, which is time.
Referring to the text, Abolition, Geography, and the Problem of Innocence, that is, every word is like a notion, I would like if you could immediately tell to us what is the biggest problem of this innocence in the carceral system in the US?
Well, in the US, in the carceral system, the problem of innocence is a problem that in itself, in its essence, divides people who have been made unfree through criminalization into two groups. Those who are relatively or absolutely innocent and therefore should be free and should have their time, and those who are not. So by making that division, the innocence reinforces exactly the kind of organized violence that abolition seeks to undo. That is to say, it is not the view of any abolitionist who is a thinking, practicing one, that harm doesn't matter. Of course it does. Of course it does. The summary that Tjaša presented to us at the beginning is a summary of, among other things, groups of humans who suffer harm, systemic harm, interpersonal harm, and so forth. So the problem of innocence is not a problem that is resolved by saying there's no harm and therefore nobody is guilty, but rather it is setting up moral categories that do not, before the fact, remedy the kinds of vulnerability and uses of organized violence that lead to harm in the first place, whether that harm occurs within the household, the family, in the workplace, in the community, at the border. And so when we talk about, for example, prison abolition, we are not saying, oh, just knock down the buildings and everything will be fine, but rather to say, what is it about organized violence that we can and must change? How does organized violence lead to and perpetuate disorganized violence? For example, how does making war convince ordinary people that the way you solve problems is by hurting somebody? Organized violence, disorganized violence. And then how can we undo the regimes of separation that are essential to the institutions of carceral geography to make abolition geography?
We have been talking a lot about Yugoslavia, socialism, capitalism, but now I would like us to continue in thinking also post-socialist context in Yugoslavia and also beyond, and in relation to what you also wrote a lot about racism and homonationalism, how homonationalism works in relation to anti-Muslim racism, and when, as we are talking about, decolonial discourse intervenes in this system, what happens?
Well, I mean, one of the simplest way to explain this is to say that if in the early 90s, Western Europe and the United States were interested in post-Yugoslav spaces because they were there to save women and children, right? And once women and children were saved, then they needed a new target, and this new target became the LGBT community. And I don't think this only happened in Bosnia and Kosovo and Macedonia. I think this happened across post-socialist spaces. It happened in Ukraine. It's happening still. It happened in all post-Soviet spaces, right? What's interesting about the discourse, the way in which the discourse was articulated in Muslim majority countries, as opposed to non-Muslim majority countries, I think it's very interesting. So for instance, in Serbia, when LGBT movements came under attack, they came under attack from skinheads and from nationalists, right? Which is very interesting. And so when they came under attack in Bosnia and in Kosovo, they came under attack by religious fundamentalists. So why are the religious fundamentalists not being identified as the homophobes in Serbia, but they're being identified such in Bosnia and Kosovo, where if you're from the region, you know that more or less the people that attack LGBT people are more or less, they all come from the same crowd, right? I mean, just generally far-right freaks who are completely disenfranchised from any kind of political engagement and who have very dubious relations to, you know, post-socialist far-right authorities. But the way in which they're being brought up in discourse is different, in part because I think to do this, you are putting pressure on the entire population to disassociate themselves with the majority religion. And so most of the pressure on Kosovars and Bosnians is for them to disidentify with Islam, right? I mean, supposedly by disidentifying with the radical forms of Islam that attack gays, they're identifying with a secular and a more European form of Islam. And so in the process of this discourse, what is happening is a normalization and secularization of religious practice itself. Most of the regulation of Islamic practice that happens in Bosnia and Kosovo, unsurprisingly, happens during this time, where religious authority comes forward and doesn't necessarily directly say that we support or we don't support gays, but actually condemns religious extremism and racializes it as something that comes from the Middle East, together with the refugees, with new influences, This is not our practice of Islam. We're white Muslims, we are secular Muslims, we're European Muslims, right? And so the moment you create this discourse, you have actually won the game of creating the kind of model Muslims that you need in the periphery, because they're seen as weak links. So you have to maintain this pressure. You have to maintain this game. You have radicals amongst you, you know, they just attack gays or and so forth. And so the need to constantly reproduce this secularism is installed to make sure that there is no politicization of Islam, that there is no radical Muslim, like Marina explained us with the guy from Berlin that said, so you could be a radical anything, but you can only be a moderate secular Muslim. And I think LGBT communities, rather intentionally or unintentionally, and I say intentionally because I think within LGBT communities, there's a lot of Islamophobia. So, but in some instances, it's also unintentional in the sense that, I mean, they really believe that religion or this particular religious community is in opposition to their claim for rights, right? So it's complex because that can be the case, but it doesn't erase the fact of how it's used strategically to sediment a very particular kind of white embodiment and secular embodiment of Islam. And I think that that designation is also important to make sure that local Muslims in the Balkans don't see Arab refugees or African refugee Muslims who come through the Balkans as being part of the same community of faith, because you don't want waters muddled in an already very precarious region with not very clear identifiable markers of who is and isn't white, right? So that tension needs to be sustained. I mean, what I find fascinating is that now, even that discourse is not there. I think now what's happening, I don't know if you've been following the news, I mean, now it's just simply drone surveillance of migrants and pure security infrastructure. When you think of the last decade, at least there was a discourse. I mean, there was, whatever you want to call it, a Euro-liberal discourse. The idea that there was a tendency to kind of designate some space to think about these things, as opposed to now where you have a carceral infrastructure that's essentially there, and that's it. But I think it's important to also speak, since we are talking about the region, there's also a lot of letdown by the left. I mean, just last week, Kurti's government, which was the hope of the left in the entire region, they signed an agreement with Denmark on the transfer of prisoners from Denmark to Kosovo. So Kosovo receives money to take in prisoners from Denmark. So Kosovo becomes this kind of state that maintains the prisoners of Europe, so to speak, while also maintaining the borders of Europe. And so Albania picks up the garbage, the toxic waste that comes from Italy. That's one of the largest imports, right? It's waste, it's medical waste. So these are all issues and processes that have happened, unfortunately, under leftist governments. When the right wing took over in Slovenia, in Bulgaria, in Greece now, they already took over from an established carceral border infrastructure, right? Tsipras left the new far-right government in Greece an infrastructure of borders that they didn't expect to find, you know? So I think that's also a problem.
Eğer bugününden kalan bir hatıraysa yarınlar hep karanlıktır, bunu sakın unutma. Sen dünyanı aydınlatacak ışık arasan da boşa. Kilit vurmuşlar kapılara. Gözlerimi açtığımda ilk defa bu dünyaya kendimi o anda yabancı buldum. Kayboldum gurbet, kokan bir denizde savruldum. Yabancılıkta doğduğum ülkede hayaller hep boş, insanlar çaresiz. Sen konuşmadan onlar sözünü kestirir. Sanki bunlardan devlet habersiz. Böyle bir şey bir arada yabancı olmak. Avrupa gibi devleti yönetenler kimliğini unutturup dostum derler. Tutuşunca etekler, çalış derler. Bitince işler git diye emreder. bist nicht du, sondern deine Seele. Das Leben ist ein Meer, vergiss nicht zu atmen, bevor dich das Wasser nimmt. Lern zu schwimmen, ich war ein Kind und muss.
Thank you first to be with us, and maybe just to say very, very shortly, the film has these two lines. One line is the relationship between decolonial insurgent politics, decolonial struggles. On the other side is the Black thought with a reference to Black Marxism. And we always focus on one work, on one event that we try to clarify with questions and actually understand what and how the author thinks. So we relate to your foreword the global contributions of Black decolonial Marxism that was published in the book Marxism and Decolonization in the 21st Century. The first question will be, what would be your reflection on epistemic ignorance in westernized universities, and also your reflection on epistemologic racism in relation to Black Marxism?
Let me say that that essay is an abbreviated translation of another essay I wrote in Spanish in a special issue I coordinated, number 28 of Tabula Rasa, where that essay in English is an abbreviated version of this introduction I did to this special issue, Tabula Rasa, on Black Marxism. And I argue there how internal colonialism, war system theory, and decoloniality, the concept of coloniality, these ideas, all of these are coming from Black Marxist tradition. And part of the problem is that there is what I call epistemic extractivism, that all these Black Marxists have been submitted to a process of extractivism of Western thinkers or Westernized thinkers that basically take their ideas and recirculate their ideas without recognition. I think that many social movements don't have to be citing authors to appropriate ideas and struggle, so I'm not coming from an academicist point of view that you have to be citing the whole time everything, otherwise you are plagiarizing and things like that. I think that's ridiculous. What I think is that given the history of invisibilization and the history of inferiorization of what is coined as the term epistemic racism, given the epistemic racism that invisibilize and inferiorize the knowledge of subjects who have been dehumanized in the modern colonial world, given that history, I think we need to do epistemic justice in terms of acknowledging where some of the critical tools used today by a lot of the left and even the decolonial network and social science at large, many of the critical tools are coming from Black thinkers, in this case, Black Marxists. And unfortunately, because of the structures of epistemic racist sexism, because for me the two go together, because in the modern world, they privilege white men of 5 countries. Fundamentally, you're going to be citing an Italian, a French, German, British, or an American. And then you might have secondarily a Dutch or a Swedish or someone else there, but usually white men of 5 countries, the one that hegemonize the canon of thought in Westernized universities. And so what happened is that this tradition, the Black Marxist tradition, or the Black radical tradition, like some people like to name or to call it, is a tradition that is very important and made many contributions. And because of epistemic racism, sexism, they've been inferiorized, invisibilized, even by people who call themselves decolonial.
the erasure and whitening is also ongoing in relation to intersectionality and Black feminist Marxism. So I would ask you why it's important to bring this into conversation and for our current and future struggles. What would you comment?
The point I'm trying to make is that this intersectionality concept is a liberal idea that has become very popular the moment the white feminists and the white Marxists saw the potential for making, in a sense, a claim of they being as oppressed as Black people. And it took away the radicality of the critique coming from the Black feminist tradition of interlocking, of multiple, Angela Davis, Barbara Smith, Patricia Riccon, others that were talking about the entanglement of oppression. Now it became so popular, so like a fashion in academia, that now even Black feminists have to use the term for people to talk to each other, you know? But I can tell you that, you know, there are famous Black feminists that are not satisfied with the use of the term because they have to be explaining the whole time what they mean, different from French. Just to say that the concept itself of intersectionality is a liberal concept, okay? It leads to this idea of separation of oppressions and to this idea that, you know, white and Black people and white people and people of color are in the same place, except with racial domination. But in class, in the other, we're in the same place. No, I'm sorry, you're not in the same place. Not even under gender domination, under class domination, under sexual, under national colonial domination, you're not in the same place. I'm sorry. You cannot make equivalent the lived experience, not the oppressions, if you bring race to the picture here, because these things are not separate, they're entangled.
Where we could look for insurgent policy, but because you talk about the political program, you are right to have a political program for the present and for the future, because the North seems almost like dead. Where in your work you see a potential of a movement, not only academic, but...
Listen, it's happening as we talk. You could see it in the anti-imperialist struggles going on in Latin America today. Indigenous movements, anti-imperialist movements in Latin America, in Africa. Look at Latin America today. The struggles of resistance going on in Latin America are also very strong, you know? And so as we talk, there are also inside the West, we lose sight of these movements also. Inside USA, the struggles, Black people, Latino people, etc. Inside the European, Western European, look at the decolonial movement.
I have actually an additional question that is coming from the previous one. When you talk about the divide between South and North, you say supposedly division. And I found this supposedly division very important because you question in a certain way very clearly. Could you comment on this? The South and the North, and we all the time replay this. So what do you want to tell us?
I think because I think I'm also trying to unthink that too. You know, that's again like me trying to unthink the intellectual discipline that I've been schooled in. I mean, like literally schooled in terms of my formal education. And so think about that, like the global North doesn't exist in isolation. All of the wealth of the global North has like accrued and accumulated through the extraction of labor, resources, land, and people from what is often labeled as the global South, right? And that accumulation, I think Marxism is really powerful in helping us think that all of those resources, all of that labor, all of that life that was extracted is still present in some form as value. And that's still like why, say, at this moment, we have the wealth inequality between the global North and the global South is so massive. Frantz Fanon says Europe is literally the creation of Africa. You know, it's like there would be no Europe if there wasn't enslaved Black, African, and on much smaller scale enslaved brown, South Asian, East Asian bodies who've been put to work in service of capitalism and capitalist nation states in the global north as empire. These things are inseparable. So, and this is still happening now. And I think the thinker who gets me most excited about this at the moment is Françoise Vergès, who's a Francophone decolonial feminist. And Vergès is literally like, how do we begin our feminism from thinking about the women who are predominantly from North Africa who are cleaning the Gare du Nord in Paris? And so it's like, how do we position them at the center of Marxist feminism? What does it mean if we're really thinking about their material interests as like the people who are at the core of our vision? I think that's still really key in terms of who is at the center of our vision of Marxist feminism. You know, are we thinking about Black and brown migrant workers? Are we thinking about precarious trans workers? Are we thinking about sex workers? You know, are those people at the center of our analysis? And how are those people otherwise excluded from that? No country is just merely itself. You know, this is the fiction of Brexit. No country exists purely because of the labor of the people who are citizens of that country or whatever. We're all in these contexts that are historically rooted as global contexts that you can't escape. You can't escape Europe. You can't escape the importance that migrant labor continues to play in all of our economies. You know, it's really naive that that's how most public discourse around the economy takes place. You know, that if you're a migrant worker, you're already immediately other in relation to workers who have citizenship within that context. And, you know, even in Britain, citizenship's now up for question. So it's like, yeah, I wish I said that more sharply, but yeah.
We are already coming to an end. What could mean for you to think trans, decolonial, and Black Marxist futures?
That's a great question. And I like that there are so many words, because putting all those words together reminds us that we have to have the confidence to think with complexity without imagining that that means we have to write for 50 years before we can do anything. That we do things with complexity in mind and then ask ourselves if what we did is getting where we want to go when we do some more, and also write and so on and so forth. So I appreciate that. For certain, one of the great challenges that we have today actually connects to something we talked about earlier. And so when I was talking about how I came to understand racism and came to understand group differentiated vulnerability, gives us actually a little insight into one of the problems that we keep encountering today, and that is that many of us, for all kinds of reasons, some good, some not so good, fixate on group differentiated vulnerability as though that were the point, that the differentiation is where we should fix ourselves into a very contained and in a way can find sort of political identity. So that, one group will say, well, this is a matter of Black people, and somebody else will say, well, this is a matter of such and such people, and so on and so forth. And then there's a lot of hostility and suspicion when somebody from some other group gets too close, right? This kind of, these assertions of authentic suffering. So one of the ways that you framed this problem in the questions you sent to me was you said, we are dragged by the form of violence. And I think that that is like a really perfect way. In other words, the historical geography of the future is one that I think we can, and this is what I've been trying to do, I think we can, constantly reveal to ourselves and help to explain to other people so that we can see there isn't one path, but there ought to be a set of principles that we agree to. And this is one of them. For example, in the United States, the Navajo Nation, one of the great formations of people still colonized by the US, made vaccines available not only for everybody who's an enrolled member of the nation, but anyone who is anywhere near the nation. Like if you could get to the nation, they'd give you a shot. If they had shots left over and there was nobody there, they'd get in a truck and drive and find people and say, do you need a shot? So the Navajo Nation, anti-colonial, Kerala, communist socialist, Sikhs, faith community with a vision of service that extends beyond the boundaries of the faith community. In all cases, there is this unboundedness that is still based in specific understandings of the world and struggles around it. And that's where I get hope. And I've come to think that way and talk that way because of the study and mentorship that I had over the years in a very large and syncretic Black radical tradition coming out of places like Guinea-Bissau and Amilcar Cabral, and out of South Africa, out of Cedric Robinson and his work, that great book, Black Marxism, Stuart Hall and the work that he did coming out of the Caribbean and then working in the UK and beyond. I already mentioned C.L.R. James, also Caribbean, and so forth. Milton Santos, a really great geographer of a generation older than me, from Brazil. So this tradition isn't an encased tradition. It is a tradition that lets us see things that might appear to be wholly separate from the tradition, but it's the understanding that matters. Or as Cedric used to say to me, it's consciousness that matters. It's not experience, it's consciousness. If it were just experience, capitalism would be over. Consciousness.
Kendimin kaptanı olup hazırım boğulmaya, bırak geceleri bana, alışırım karanlığa, bir mum yakıp ardından konuşurum yalnızımla.
Zordur bazen hayat, yorar seni. Mutluluk da yan komşu gibi uğrar arada bir. Susuz bir çölde su arar misali, yolunu kaybetmiş gibi.